Everyone, we're glad that you've joined us today. My name is Lou-Anne Good-Gingrich. I'm the director of the Global Labor Research Center at York University in Toronto, Ontario. The GLRC is very pleased to be hosting this important discussion today on care and care work and care workers. The GLRC at York is a vibrant community of scholars and students who engage in interdisciplinary research and collaboration related to work, labor, and livelihoods. So I invite you to check out our website, drop us an email, we'd be glad to connect with you. We also gratefully acknowledge the generous support of Dr. Ethel Tungahan and Dr. Leah Vosco, who are both members of the GLRC Executive Committee. And we're also grateful for the support of the Center for Feminist Research at York. And I invite you to also check out their website at yorku.ca/CFR. So this is a timely discussion for us today, as we've been confronted with the harsh realities that result from a failure to adequately care for one another. Caring and care work is vital to our individual and collective well-being, physical health, mental health, social relationships and security, economic stability, environmental sustainability, even our very survival. Yet we've also seen in the past year, in alarming ways, that our society and institutions have long devalued and disparaged care and care workers, as if caring for one another poses some sort of threat. This self-destructive trend is worthy of courageous analysis and action, and hence I'm looking forward very much to the discussion today. It's my pleasure to introduce our chair for this discussion, Danielle Belski. Drew conceived of and organized this discussion today, and we're grateful for her creative and care-filled work. Drew's a PhD candidate in Science and Technology Studies at York University. Situated at the intersection of feminist science and technology studies, disability studies, and visual culture, her dissertation is entitled Making Bodies, Making Kin, Storytelling and the Professionalization of Medical Illustrators in North America. Drew explores the gendered dynamics of scientific labor and the epistemic role of image making in medicine. I will add that Drew's been working with us at the GLRC on a few projects for most of this academic year, and I've been impressed by the depth and creativity of her scholarship, as well as her committed leadership with other students. So thank you, Drew, for your time with us. And I turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you, Lou-Anne. That's a really kind introduction. So I'm going to just quickly go over a few access notes and then give a bit of an introduction and land acknowledgement. So we do have captioning available throughout the event. You can enable subtitles or see a real-time transcript by clicking on More at the bottom of your screen. A full transcript and a video recording will also be available after the event. This event is being recorded, just so everyone is aware. So to assist with captioning and transcripts, we'll just ask anyone who's speaking to please identify yourself before speaking. So for example, this is Drew speaking, and to also be mindful of your speed and clarity when you're speaking. And we're also just asking that everyone other than the speaker, please keep your mics off and wait to be acknowledged before speaking. I'll be collecting questions and comments. Anyone who wishes to speak, you can just direct message me in the chat, and then I'll sort of be collating those and using that to facilitate the discussion. So today I just want to welcome everyone, first of all. Our presenters and the audience are joining us from many different places. And so welcome, we're very glad to be with you today. Again, my name is Danielle Belski, and I'll be chairing the discussion today with help from our discussant, Dr. Mary Jean Handy. I want to use this opportunity for those of us who are settlers to address the ways in which legacies of colonialism and imperialism continue to shape working conditions, access to healthcare and other forms of care, as well as the very categories of both disability and work. Many of us are settlers in the lands we inhabit, particularly those of us who have some of the most access and power in academic institutions. And it is therefore our collective responsibility in gatherings like this to pay respect and to recognize the traditional inhabitants and caretakers of these places, many of whom have been violently displaced from them. The land where I live and work, and where York University is situated, is a place where many human groups, including the Iroquois, Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Mississauga, the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and others, have met and exchanged stories and the materials of life for more than 1,000 years. The current treaty holders of this land are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and this territory is also the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region, as well as the Two-Row Wampum Belt Treaty, which calls for mutual respect and peace between settler and Indigenous nations. The current inhabitants of the place where I live include the descendants of many of these Indigenous and First Nations peoples from across the continent, as well as the settlers who displaced many of them, and many other people displaced from many other geographies. The relations between these different human groups are informed by intersecting histories of colonization, repression, and involuntary migration, but also still remain subject to the relations of mutual responsibility and care established by those early agreements. The unequal distribution of care and risk in this pandemic demands that we confront the ways in which those legacies of colonialism and imperialism have defined not only which lives matter, but how, when, and for whom they matter. For those of us who are settlers, it is our particular responsibility to do this work and to be unsettled by it. We are here because this land was and is occupied. It is therefore our collective responsibility to recognize our colonial histories and their present-day implications, as well as to honor, protect, and sustain both the land and each other. So with this in mind, I just want to, again, reiterate some of the ways that we're working to reduce barriers to participation and make this event more accessible. They are imperfect, and we welcome your feedback for the future. The webpage for this event includes documents containing the text I'm currently presenting, as well as speaker bios and additional speaking notes. The speaker's individual speaking notes are posted separately. I'm going to just share that link in the chat right now if I'm able to copy and paste it. Great. And so that will take you to the link with the web page, as well as individual links to speaking notes. As I mentioned before, we do have captioning available, so you can enable subtitles by clicking on the more at the bottom of your screen, and full transcript and video will be available after the event. Each of our speakers has prepared a short reflection on the topic of care and embodied labor in COVID-19. So they will be presenting those, and then we'll take a short break to give ourselves some time to move, maybe get a drink of water, and also to allow a moment for everyone to collect their thoughts before the discussion. After the break, our discussant will offer some further reflection and an opening question to get us started with a broader discussion. If you have a question or a comment, please message me directly using the chat function. I'll be collecting and facilitating the discussion from there. I'll do my best to ensure that we're able to address as many different questions as possible and in an equitable fashion. This means that if there are several similar questions, I might summarize them more generally rather than calling upon an individual, and I can also relay questions anonymously if any audience members would like that. And so I'll attempt to also briefly summarize the questions in the chat just for clarity and for reference for everyone. So with all that said, I want to introduce our panel. Odelia Bay is a doctoral student at Osgoode Hall Law School. Her dissertation project examines self-care and workplace accommodations for people with episodic disabilities. That is, disabilities characterized by unpredictable and fluctuating impairments. Odelia completed her Master of Laws degree at Columbia Law School, where she was also awarded a graduate student fellowship with the Future Disability Studies Project at Columbia University. She is also called to the Ontario Bar and has taught a number of law school courses, including labor law and critical race theory. Currently, Odelia is working to help create and build the Canadian Association of Lawyers with Disabilities, or Association Canadienne des Juristes en Situation de Handicap. Nicole Leach currently works as a researcher with SEIU Healthcare. SEIU Healthcare represents healthcare workers across Ontario, including those working in hospitals, community care, and home care organizations, retirement homes, and nursing homes. In a previous life, Nicole was a doctoral candidate in politics at York University, where her dissertation examined the neoliberalization of social reproduction, specifically how these politics are enacted through foreign temporary worker programs. Dr. Fumilayo Showers is an assistant professor of sociology and Africana studies at the University of Connecticut. Her research centers on US immigration, healthcare work, and immigrant workers. In particular, she studies African immigrants in professional healthcare settings. She explores the organizational structures of healthcare institutions as gendered and racialized, with implications for how Black workers navigate everyday situations and seek upward mobility. She also investigates how recent Black immigrants use ethnic networks to seek opportunity in healthcare and to build communities and social capital in the face of racial discrimination and blocked opportunities encountered in the US. Dr. Showers is currently completing her book manuscript, Migrants Who Care, West Africans at the Front Lines of US Healthcare Industry, with Rutgers University Press. The book chronicles the lived experiences of African immigrants as direct care workers, as well as labor brokers in healthcare provision. And she completed her PhD and Master's in Sociology at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs of Syracuse University, with a bachelor's degree from Agnes Scott College in Decatur, Georgia. And finally, our last panelist is Dr. Laura Molden, who is an associate professor of women's gender and sexuality studies and human development and family sciences at the University of Connecticut. A sociologist of health, illness, and disability, much of her work bridges disability studies, medical sociology, and science and technology studies. She is the author of the book Made to Hear, Cochlear Implants and Raising Deaf Children, and is a nationally certified sign language interpreter. You can also find out a whole lot more about her work at her website, lauramolden.com, or follow her on Twitter, which is delightful. And lastly, our discussant will be Dr. Mary Jean Handay, who is currently a postdoctoral student at Mount St. Vincent University. Dr. Handay is a critical health scholar who draws on critical disability studies, feminist, anti-racist, and historical materialist approaches to understanding care work and care policy in an aging, globalized world. Her research and teaching is community and user engaged and prioritizes marginalized perspectives and transformative social change. Her current research focuses on transnational political economies of caring for older and disabled people, considering the relations of racialized immigrant labor and quality of life for older and disabled people in Canadian long-term residential and home care systems. She also leads a community-engaged SSHRC Insight Development Grant right now, which is examining the struggles of immigrant home care workers in Manitoba during the COVID-19 pandemic, and is also working with the Nova Scotia Centre on Aging on 2 CIHR grants, examining how home care and long-term care policies in multiple Canadian jurisdictions shape formal and informal practices of caring for older people. So now that we have introduced all of you just a little bit, we'll let you all speak a bit more about your own work and your own thoughts on this topic. And so the panel is going to start now with Odelia Bay.
Thank you. Thank you, Drew, for that lovely introduction, and also for organizing today's event. So this is Odelia speaking. And for those people who are not looking at my image today, I will tell you what I look like. I am a cis woman, a youthful looking person in her early 40s, and I have long, straight black hair with a Middle Eastern complexion. My talk right now will be probably a mix of formal and informal. I am going to read some of my notes and also just blah, blah, blah a little bit, but I think that characterizes the COVID world quite well. In fact, I am dressed formally on top and wearing my ninja socks on the bottom. So, you know, that's COVID life right now, the mix of formal and informal. So the paper I'm presenting today, Working Crip Time, Exploring the Relationship Between Episodic Disability and Work in and After the COVID-19 Pandemic, is based largely on a chapter that's forthcoming this summer in a text titled Law and Disability in Canada. So I'm going to talk a little bit about episodic disability and why I focus on employment and labor as a center for my thoughts on these issues. I myself identify as someone with an episodic disability. I have multiple sclerosis, and I have decided that it's important to disclose this information with my work because I do come to it with my own experiential knowledge as well. So for many of us, you know, the first question that people often ask is, oh, what do you do after you introduce yourself with your name? And work and employment certainly is integral to our economic well-being as well as other forms of well-being. It provides the foundation for our social citizenship. It's central to our identity, and it allows us to form and fulfill our hopes and dreams, as well as providing us with a way to connect with and contribute to our communities. Work and our ability to participate in work is care, and workplaces also form the centers or catalysts for care and care communities. Quickly, in terms of statistics, somewhere between 20 and 25% of Canadian adults identify as having some form of disability. And more than 80% of those people identify as having an episodic disability, which Drew mentioned in my introduction as well, but I'll just reiterate that definition. Episodic disabilities are generally long-term conditions with fluctuating and unpredictable periods and degrees of wellness and disability that impact on all aspects of daily life. The other definition that I want to talk about is my working definition of self-care, because it's a lovely catchphrase right now. And I want to be sure that I'm looking at self-care and its relationship also within community care, not as a neoliberal and individualistic practice, but rather an integral part of how we relate to each other and form communities. Audre Lorde wrote, and I quote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." Indeed, self-care becomes a political act, particularly in the context of employment, when time, energy, and most of all, labor power is diverted from productivity to look after one's own well-being. Foucault also has a lovely conception of self-care. He calls care for the self. And he says it's not a kind of self-love or egoism or individual interest, but rather self-care is a practice of self-awareness and self-improvement that contributes to one's own ability to participate as part of a collective. And this takes time. This kind of time that we're speaking about as well is often referred to as crip time when it comes to self-care in the context of disability. Crip time specifically refers to a reclaiming of the ways in which time, as a measure that often appears neutral on its face, is actually differently experienced and conceived through a disabled lens. And this is in contradiction to maybe dominant temporalities. I really like the idea of normate from Rosemary Garland Thompson. So I talk sometimes in my work about normate time in order to trouble those conceptions of what is actually normal or typical. It makes us pause for a moment. Normate, what's that? Elizabeth Freeman, a cultural and queer theorist, has done a lot of thinking about time, and I'm going to come back to some of her more recent work at the end. But she talks about how time is related to conceptions of the self, to how we relate to each other, to our citizenship and our productivity. There are events in our lives that we register as important or not important. We are expected to achieve things or do things at particular times in our lives. We are expected to take particular amounts of time in order to achieve or accomplish tasks. And all of this preconceived notion about time also frames how we value people. The experience of disability itself is both temporal, that is time sensed, as well as corporal, and that is body sensed. And so crip time, or the way that people with disabilities experience and understand time, is unique in a couple of respects, both negative and positive. I describe it here as stretched, elongated, or shuffled time. It's the extra time needed to do things as a result either of impairments or assistive measures. So for example, additional time to schedule transportation in advance of a meeting, etc. I really like also thinking about the positive opportunity of crip time. So Petra Koppers talks about crip time as a form of sanctuary, moments out of time, out of productive, forward-leaning time that provide opportunities for creativity, contemplation, and disability culture politics. Alison Kafer has a really lovely way of talking about how crip time also has ways of changing or refocusing time that we all experience. She writes, crip time is flex time, not just expanded, but exploded. It requires a reimagining of our notions of what can and should happen in time, or recognizing how expectations of how long things take are based on very particular minds and bodies. We can then understand the flexibility of crip time as being not only an accommodation to those who need more time, but also, and perhaps especially, a challenge to normative and normalizing expectations of pace and scheduling. Rather than bend disabled bodies and minds to meet the clock, crip time bends the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. And this brings me to the last of the pieces that I wanted to talk about from this paper, and that is the relationship between crip time and pandemic time. So we have all restructured our lives to prevent and reduce incidents of disability, illness, and even death. And while we've been motivated by our collective and even individual best interests, many of these changes have created more inclusive and accessible working conditions for disabled workers, perhaps more caring conditions. The pandemic has changed when, where, and how we work. People work remotely from home, Zooming into meetings, adjusting their work schedules to take care of family needs and accommodate their own new circadian rhythms that no longer seem to adhere to a regular workday or standard calendar. Even those who are frontline workers or essential workers and can't work from home maybe have changed their shifts, experience different travel time, both in the length of time, but also how they experience it, perhaps with newfound anxiety about safety or contingency plans for some things like bathrooms en route. And they've also had to learn how to build in extra time for things like PPE and cleaning and disinfecting. So collectively, we're all managing time differently. Our sense of time perhaps is muddled or felt as a loss or confusing loop. So Freeman, who I mentioned earlier, talks about this as crip time for the masses. And we're all kind of learning about these feelings of isolation, delayed gratification, blurring of work, home life, things that folks with disabilities experience on an ongoing basis. But these things are the crip time and pandemic time are different because pandemic time will eventually come to an end. And so we can think about pandemic time as having a finite ending at some point, and we get to return to a normal or new normal. But this idea of normal time or normate time will still again apply to the typical majority and not those folks with disabilities. So what can we do with this understanding? My hope is that in a post-COVID world, we'll retain some collective knowledge about the ways that we've experienced pandemic time and how we were able to be flexible and problem solve, allowing for failed attempts to be generative rather than stifling. And maybe this will lead to more caring and accessible futures for all. Thank you.
Thanks, Adelia. So our next speaker is going to be Nicole Leach.
Hi, everyone. I guess before getting into my preliminary thoughts, I need to express a disclaimer that the views expressed in this presentation are those of myself and don't represent the people or institutions or organizations that I'm associated with in my professional capacity. So just needed to get that out of the way. So before we showed up today, we were given a few questions to kind of think over in terms of these presentations and the reason we're all gathering. One of those questions were, how are the bodies of workers and those they work with made visible or invisible in epidemiology, economics, and health policy, especially in the context of the pandemic? And so I was going to take a few moments to speak to that question in particular. For me, one of the things that this pandemic has done is made visible on a wide and public scale the fact that there are actually workers in long-term care homes and retirement homes. A fact that seems to be ignored generally kind of prior to the last year. When we think of epidemiology, economics, or health policy, workers in senior care industries are largely absent from these conversations. This type of social reproduction work lives at a particular intersection of disability, race, gender, fragility, disposability, and marginality that makes invisibility for these workers the norm. Seniors care facilities like retirement homes, assisted living centers, and nursing homes are spaces that house people who are seen as having aged out of the productive workforce. They are not productive spaces that catch policy or public attention. Armstrong and Banerjee have discussed these spaces as, quote, reflecting the North American characterization of such care as failure. Failure of medicine to cure, of the family to care, and of the individual to be independent, end quote. Or as Guberman has summarized, quote, they're seen as the last and least attractive option when we seek to avoid rather than to positively develop, end quote. So these spaces are those that cause people discomfort. And spaces in where ignorance is willfully chosen, especially within epidemiology, economics, or health policy, when what garners the most attention is that of productive spaces, of production of workers, of materials, of profit, and so on and so forth. So these are highly precarious workplaces, despite the high union density within the industry. And here I'm particular speaking about Canada in general and Ontario in particular. In Ontario, union density sits around 80% for nursing homes. So it's a site of social reproduction and caring labor. The workforce is highly feminized and highly racialized, with a good portion of racialized workers being new to Canada, and with some of the workers in these industries having previous experiences in Canada's living caregiver programs and through precarious migration channels in earlier periods. Nursing homes, especially if we're talking private for-profit nursing homes, mainly offer precarious employment relationships, and high percentages of the workforce are part-time employment rather than full-time. Wages are devastatingly low, and turnover rates are ridiculously high in these industries. Nursing homes and a large majority of retirement homes in Ontario fall under what's been named HILDA, or the Hospital Labor Disputes Arbitration Act, which means that they've been deemed essential, like hospital workers, and have been stripped and denied of the right to strike. So this leads to a particular scenario where unions who represent these workers inside the long-term care industries have been fighting for years, trying to call attention to the precarious nature of the work, to the quality of these employment relationships decreasing, leading to the quality of work decreasing, and the health risks posed by the neoliberalization of care work, which includes out of whack staffing ratios where there's huge amounts of part-time employment and very few full-time positions offered, and where employees have to work multiple jobs to barely make it past the poverty line. So the low-income cutoff line, or the point below which a family will likely devote a larger share of its income on the necessities of food, shelter, and clothing than the average family, or in short, the poverty line, in 2019 for one person was just over 25,000. For a two-person household, so a single parented dependent, it's 31,000, 31.5. And for a three-person household, so if you're thinking about a parent plus a dependent and an elderly parent they're caring for, that's 38.7 thousand. So the average wages across SEIU nursing homes is around, for a housekeeping aide, is around $20 an hour, $20.44 an hour. For a dietary aide, it's $20.84 an hour. For a PSW, which if you live in Ontario, you've heard that term a lot lately, the average wage is $21.28. And for an activity aide, it's $20.36. if you are working a full-time job at those wages, your annual earnings are going to be between $36,000 and $38,000, placing you about $10,000 above the poverty line if you're a single person. Only $5,000 above it if you have a child or one dependent, and under the poverty line if you have more than one dependent. If you're working part-time, you're looking at being between $6,000 and $7,000 under the poverty line if you're working the highest amount of hours as a part-time worker that you can. So those are some starking numbers if you think about the reality of it. The reality is that 60% of SEIU's nursing home workers are working part-time and are underemployed in that part-time status. So not working those full part-time hours. Now, this was looking at hours prior to the pandemic, where since the start of the pandemic, they've also been ordered to only work at one workplace in order to try to contain the spread. So some of these members have then gotten full-time wages or full-time hours at that one workplace. A lot haven't. And a lot of these workers are working ridiculous hours because of short staffing across nursing home and retirement homes because of the pandemic. However, being viewed as, quote, unproductive spaces and being the subject matter that the public does not like discussing because it opens up people to having to discuss aging and disability. And because these workers are gendered and racialized, and it becomes an uphill battle to get people to listen to calls and cries for better working conditions or better caring conditions. Because these workers have been stripped of the right to strike, the ability to pressure employers is somewhat neutered, and the ability to garner media attention and demand public support or solidarity is highly mitigated. When Bill 124, the quote, Protecting a Sustainable Public Sector for Future Generations Act, was enacted in Ontario, and it is a bill that imposed 1% total compensation increase limits to workers in certain industries, for-profit nursing homes being one of them, hospitals being another. Really, any public industry was caught under this bill, meaning that they could only get increases of 1% total per year. That includes wages or dental or all those other benefits that go into a compensation consideration for 3 years. So 1% each year for 3 years is the max that they can get. Well, when this was imposed by Doug Ford, teachers who were right at the end of their collective agreement cycle went out on strike, garnered tons of media attention. They were able to debate the validity of Bill 124 hotly in the media. They were able to make big pushes and garner a lot of attention. Whether or not that led to support was a bit precarious, but there was at least lots of talk going on about whether or not this is a bill that should have been imposed. Unfortunately, a new collective agreement was settled for these workers before any push for Bill 124 to be dropped was heard. But since then, unions representing nursing home workers have been trying to push back against Bill 124, and there's no press coverage. There's no media mention of the various things that these workers and these unions have done. No media attention is being paid to it. There's no ability to garner that support. So one of the things is that COVID has actually blown up the context for different types of conversations to be had around Ontario's long-term care homes. For the first time in a long time, they've actually been the center of debate. And while there still remains a large divide within public and media attention between workers in these spaces and residents in these spaces, and who's allowed to be sympathized with and who do we care for, there's actually a tension in this area. You know, it's opened up possibilities that were not open for a long time. Unions and nursing home and retirement home sectors have been calling for minimum care standards of 4 hours per resident per day with funding to match. Government reports, commissions, trade union reports, association reports, academic studies have been calling for a minimum of 4 hours care for over 2 decades. And these calls have been ignored at best. And COVID-19 has created an opportunity where unions and different groups were able to push back and actually get that instituted in a highly precarious and underwhelming way, but it is more movement than has been seen in 2 decades on that issue. So this has presented a weird window for unions and especially supporting long-term care and seniors care industries. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. So much to think on. And so building a bit on that, but in a very different context, is Dr. Fumilayo Showers will be going next.
I want to thank you, Drew, and all involved in organizing this roundtable for this invitation and for all the labor that went into putting this event together. For those of you who need this, I am a dark-skinned Black woman, youngish, with long, straight Black hair. I am wearing a dark green top and green headband in my hair. My goal is to account for the experiences of immigrant workers, in particular West African immigrant care workers in the US, who are largely rendered invisible as immigrants and as workers in this sector. Africans are a small but growing immigrant population. They make up 4% of the total share of the US immigrant population, yet they account for 12% of the immigrant healthcare workforce. Not only are they concentrated at the lower tiers of the healthcare hierarchy as nursing assistants and home care workers, but they're also significantly represented as registered nurses. So I argue that it is important to study this group, and they have a lot to tell us about healthcare work. I draw my insights mostly from interviews among a research sample, majority women, but also men, who are primarily based in the Washington, DC metro area. They work as elder care workers, disability support staff, and licensed practical nurses and registered nurses. Some had opened businesses, mostly recruitment agencies for home care support, where they hired other West Africans mostly. Some had opened group homes and day program support for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. A point worthy of note is that they were not care workers in their home countries. In fact, many were unaware of care work, such as disability support or institutional elder care as paid employment. In their pre-migration world, this sort of care was the labor that family members performed for loved ones. So in my work generally, I have been interested in unearthing the processes that allow for everyday migrants to become transformed into care workers, or in the framing I use in my current book project, how migrants become produced, repackaged, and deployed as healthcare workers. I have been interested in the factors that allow for these immigrants to come to the US in the first place. In particular, I look at the impact of US immigration policies in shaping the migration and later labor force trajectories of migrants. I should say that my research participants entered the US through regular immigration channels, mostly through family reunification provisions, also as refugee or asylum seekers, or as diversity visa lottery winners. Unlike the Canadian context, there is no temporary visa category or pathway to permanent residence for paraprofessional care workers. I also explore the failure of the post-colonial African state. I look at the presence of wars, civil unrest, corruption, etc., and neo-colonial formations, such as neoliberal economic policies, in creating the socioeconomic conditions that compel many, including educated middle-class professionals, to leave. After migration, I am interested in the processes that facilitate their entry into care work. In particular, I look at the impact of credentialing and licensing regimes that prevented their entry into other areas of the labor force, or even when they made successful transfers into the primary labor market or previous occupations. For example, to work as high school teachers, they encountered racial discrimination and a specific form of racial animus against Africans that I and others have called African origin discrimination. Turned away from previous occupations due to the devaluation of their qualifications, they turn to a labor niche that lacks an exorbitant credentialing process and that is cost-effective to enter. Usually work as home health aides or certified nursing assistants became their first entry point into the US labor market. Those who held professional jobs in healthcare at the time of my research reported that they had started at the bottom and worked their way up. I conducted my research before the COVID-19 pandemic. However, I offer a few thoughts on the implications of COVID-19 for this group of workers, drawing from informal conversations with and social media accounts of care workers in my network. I also draw on the work of anthropologist Katie Coe, who has collected more recent data on African home care workers and certified nursing assistants during the pandemic. I think we can make some generalizations about the impact of COVID on all immigrant care workers, or all care workers for that matter. For instance, experiences of overwork, burnout, emotional strain, fear of contagion, especially in the early days of the pandemic, and obviously infection and mortality from COVID-19. I do believe, however, that there are distinct experiences for different groups of workers. In my research, I found that immigrants' experiences were different based on where they work and where they were located in labor hierarchies. I also draw from the arguments made by sociologist Mignon Duffy, who made conceptual distinctions in care work based on differences in perceived skill, the nature or type of care performed, as well as racial stratification among the bodies that are involved in care. Also, sociologist and health policy scholar Nicole Leach, working out of the UK, has argued that we should take seriously the context within which the work occurs. So within the context of COVID, there will be differences among workers in hospitals versus nursing homes and private homes. I will close by giving brief examples of how workers in these settings could be affected differently, drawing from the perspectives of Africans. According to Katie Coe, in nursing homes, especially early on in the pandemic, workers reported lack of PPE and feeling unprotected and vulnerable. In the UK, nurses in particular in the new UK, agency nurses, mostly Black workers, talked about the fact that there was racial discrimination playing out. They felt that they were rotated most often in COVID wards, and they lacked the protection that the full-time staff members in these institutions. I don't have a sense if this happened in the US, but these are sort of issues that we could think about in terms of whether these experiences were mitigated by race. Care workers in nursing homes also talked about the deaths, the many deaths of residents. Home care aides who typically eke together a living by working multiple jobs with a number of care recipients cut down on hours or reported being let go by fearful family members, thereby increasing their precarious conditions of work. Living home care workers felt that they were under more suspicion and scrutiny as potential vectors of the virus. Finally, in my conversations with African nurses, they were more likely to talk about the stress of being at the front lines of combating a novel virus. They also talked about the deaths that they witnessed and the emotional toll, especially in the height of the various waves of the pandemic. I will stop here for now and look forward to the conversation later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Femi. And so we'll just move on now to the last speaker on the panel, Dr. Laura Molden.
Thank you, Drew, for your organizing of this event and your careful consideration of accessibility. I really appreciate all of that labor that you and those assisting you have done. So thank you so much. So for those of you who need it, I am a white and I guess middle-aged at this point woman in wearing a black shirt and green cardigan, coming to you from Brooklyn, New York. So my work focuses on unpaid caregiving. I'm currently working on a book project right now, supported by the Social Science Research Council, and it's based on fieldwork with spousal or partner unpaid caregivers specifically, and when possible, including their partner in the work. So I want to say that I'm focused specifically on spousal or partner caregivers for a few reasons. And this is because studies put out by the National Alliance for Caregiving and AARP show that compared to other kinds of unpaid caregivers, like maybe siblings or adults caring for their aging parents and things like that, spouses assist with more activities of daily living. They perform more medical tasks. They're almost always the sole caregiver without any other additional help. And they're far more likely to be doing what studies categorize as high intensity caregiving. So they're a little bit different from some of the other unpaid caregivers. And over the last year, I interviewed more than 50 people across the United States, including 43 caregivers ages 29 to 87 across 21 states. And I interviewed all of them twice. Some of my longest interviews were 2.5 hours. So I spent a lot of time with these folks. I published some initial findings with regard to COVID in the Caring Across Generations blog. So in the access text, it has a link to it. But I'm just going to summarize quickly some of what I found during the pandemic, specifically because I was conducting this fieldwork during the pandemic, but at the same time, a lot of these issues are actually ongoing issues. They were just either exacerbated or perhaps some things actually made a little worse and some things made a little better, like telehealth and things like that. So it's a mixed bag. But overall, during the pandemic, spousal caregivers, like the rest of us and also other frontline workers, and I do think about these unpaid caregivers as frontline healthcare workers in a way, they were full of anxiety and fear. So they were, the vulnerability of their spouse was their key concern. And many said to me, you know, if my spouse or partner gets COVID, they'll certainly die. That's the end. So some of these folks who were still in working age and working lower paying jobs, particularly in rural areas in the US, where residents may not have been taking COVID seriously, were especially anxious and stressed because they had to be in public with other people who they felt like could possibly be exposing them, and then they were terrified to go home. Those of retirement age largely didn't leave the house because they were so terrified that one small mistake would be fatal if they went out. Like many of us, spousal caregivers were isolated. Their loneliness came through in my interviews. They talked about the lack of social interaction and the detrimental effects that this was having, particularly the emotional toll of not being able to attend their support groups or being able to see friends, and particularly for the older folks, not being able to see their grandchildren. Third, support systems, including hospitals, were in free fall during particularly the early points in the pandemic, leaving spousal caregivers to do even more caregiving and even more medical care on their own. So as Dr. Showers pointed out, many aides were let go out of fear of bringing the virus into the home. So many of these families lost their home health aides, primarily too because the home health agencies that employ them were under no mandate whatsoever to provide testing or time off to get tested or anything like that. So these kinds of things were making having home health aides come into the house even riskier in their minds. Furthermore, hospitals were no longer, like going to the ER for an issue was no longer a possibility because they were so afraid of exposing their spouse or partner to COVID. So what ended up happening is that so many spousal caregivers were actually performing medical care through video or the phone with their healthcare providers. This included infection monitoring, giving infusions, and even caring for really gruesome wounds. So they were doing like gruesome wound care at home, unsupported because they couldn't go to a hospital. Spousal caregivers also reported that their partner was deteriorating. And this deterioration was attributed to two things. One was a lack of socialization with friends or family. And so they became more withdrawn and depressed. And the second was that they lost their access to routine physical or occupational therapy, and they were rapidly losing strength and flexibility. And everyone was very worried about the long-term and drastic effects, both mentally and physically, that the pandemic was having. And I think, you know, just to pick up on a couple of threads that others have talked about, is that this kind of care, in particular unpaid care in the home, is invisible and people don't know about it. And making this visible is part of the work that I'm trying to do. And it's also about you know, dealing with the discomfort of disability and illness and talking about that head on. And so in that regard, I just want to sort of make some broader comments. You know, certainly there's a lot that we could discuss in terms of what I just reported, right? In terms of how the pandemic has strained already inadequate and crumbling long-term care, home and community-based services in the US in particular. And what I want to partly do here is to think about how looking at these struggles of caregivers points not necessarily towards the tragedy, quote unquote, of disability and illness, but rather to problems with our systems. I don't want my above list to be interpreted as a series of types of, quote, individual caregiver burdens. I think this notion of caregiver burden can over-individualize. Instead, I want to emphasize that those burdens, both during COVID-19, before and after, are structural. So their burden is the result of bearing the weight of being structurally abandoned in many ways. And that is, our infrastructure is so poor in the US that unpaid caregivers are often the care infrastructure for family members. And this is a central argument that I talk about in my book. And it's basically that caregivers, and I think we could include paid care workers here to an extent as well, are dangerously abandoned because, quite simply, we devalue ill and disabled people. If we don't value disabled people, then why would we value the people who care for them? We need only to recall moments in the pandemic that exposed that kind of raw ableism. Disabled people are disposable. Older folks should sacrifice themselves for the economy. More than one government official stated ideas like this in media interviews. So in my view, the lives of caregivers and the lives of ill and disabled people overlap. They're yoked together. Their predicaments are shared. Both are products of ableist ideologies. So to understand why we devalue caregiving, it requires that we not only understand the sexism and the racism at its heart, but also how ableism, or bias against disability or bodies deemed unproductive, quote unquote, plays a role. So I think about ableism as an ideology that devalues non-normative bodies and any kind of dependence or need for care. And ableism is at the heart of American ideals that equate independence with worth. It profoundly shapes how our care systems are structured and funded or not in the first place. Ableism tells us that some people are worthy of collective care and concern and others are not. Ableism denies that disability and illness are entirely normal and expectable parts of life. Ableism is not seeing that disabled people contribute to the world and that caregivers and paid care workers are often disabled themselves and that care work is disabling. Ableism is rooted in eugenics and clearly reflected in US neoliberal policies related to a lack of universal health care and home care support. So in my view, I want to think about how care scholarship and advocacy around care can engage with disability and confront ableism. So I use disability broadly here, even though I'm capturing a heterogeneous category of disabled, chronically ill, and elderly people, all of which are affected by the same structures and systems of care, though they experience these systems in different ways depending upon what other social locations they occupy, and they're stratified across race and gender, immigration status, and so on. And I think the good news is that if we start to talk about care as a disability issue and as connected to ableism, that it opens up new possibilities for cross-movement mobilization between caregiving organizations and disability communities and organizations, both of which have long argued for better home and community-based services and long-term care supports. So there's also so much work being done on the ground by disability justice advocates. I think about the folks in the Bay Area, particularly groups like Sins Invalid. They've been out here all along, but prior to the pandemic and particularly stepping up during it, shouting that our systems are failing, and we're actively creating new relations of care based on mutual aid and collective care. So those are really fertile sites for cross mobilization, I think, in our advocacy around better care infrastructure. So I want to just connect all of this with care and to put out there that caregivers and disabled and ill people and their partners, they are backed into these perilous circumstances during COVID-19, prior and always, without support, not just because we think so little of caregiving and those who we either pay or family members ask to care, but because we don't value the people they're actually caring for either. So this devaluation then leaves millions of families to face seemingly insurmountable obstacles when they're simply trying to ensure folks can live a good life in the face of the entirely expectable and human experience of disability and illness. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And what a great way to sort of draw everything together. So thank you for that as well. So this is Drew speaking again, and we're just going to take a quick break for about 5 minutes to give everyone a moment to take a breath, have a stretch, maybe a drink of water, bathroom, whatever you need, and also to take some time to collect our thoughts and reflect about what kinds of comments and questions we bring to this. And process a bit of it, you know, I want to also acknowledge that just the emotional toll of the work that we're talking about and the work of engaging with all of that and discussing that. I know I feel it, and I am not nearly as much in the thick of it as some of our speakers. So, and so just before we break, I just want to quickly suggest that in keeping with reflections by scholars like Eve Tuck, that as we think about what kind of questions we want to offer, that we think about how they are making space for something generous and generative, and to really consider what needs to be said or needs to be asked in a very generous way. So we'll meet back here, I guess, in maybe about 5 minutes. So that would be a little before 1/4 afternoon. We'll hear from our discussant, just a few comments, and then open up for discussion. So if you have a question or comment, you can message me directly using the chat function, and I'll work on collating all of that as we move forward. But take a break. I'm just going to give another minute or so for folks to trickle back in. Again, if you have any questions, please do go ahead and message them to me. I'll collect them and do my best to see that we get to as many as we can. So just feel free to come through with that. So I think if Mary Jean is ready, we can go ahead.
Sure, thank you very much. This is Mary Jean Handy speaking. I'm a white woman with light brown hair, and I'm wearing a black shirt with strawberry earrings and glasses. And you may hear some toddler chatter in the background. My daughter just got back from her morning adventures and she seems to be wanting to chat. So this might be in the background. It's been a true pleasure to hear all of your presentations and to think through some of the common threads and points of tensions across your presentations at the roundtable today as a discussant. Each of the presentations presents such distinct insights into care and caring during the pandemic, highlighting, despite the truism that we're quote unquote all in this together, the pandemic is experienced very differently across different bodies, communities, and social locations. As Fumalayo mentioned, context matters so much when it comes to care work. And yet, as I discussed the speaker's notes with Drew yesterday, we were both really struck by how each of the presenters touched on time dynamics being restructured and mobilized through the pandemic. In Odelia's presentation in particular, we were presented with the contrasting notions of pandemic time and crypt time, and how this has opened up opportunities for pause and for new understandings of access for everyone, not just for those who are kind of typically categorized as disabled. But I'm also reminded of something that my PhD supervisor, Jamie Magnuson, once said: there is never enough time under capitalism. And we have to actually fight hard to make life possible in such deadly and violent times, and to fight for time to heal and to care well for people, time to organize, time to imagine a new world. And for disabled people, we've seen how access technologies have been used to intensify labor rather than honor crypt time. And there's an urgent struggle to for adequate care hours in institutions that has been bitterly fought for by health unions and organized labor, as Nicole emphasized so clearly. And the challenges of being on the front lines of the pandemic, providing care on call, unpaid care for people you cannot distance yourself from, living with people that you live with, whether a spouse or as a live-in caregiver, or never knowing when your rights will be suspended or when you will be able to see family again, as in the case of many migrant workers. So it takes a very heavy toll on mental health and strains the possibilities of any semblance of healthy, caring or relationships immensely. And I just also wanted to reflect on, that there seems to be, the pandemic seems to be this kind of state of exception, not in the, kind of typical Agamben sense, but that, we're kind of in this limbo land. It's really organized by race and gender, immigration status, disability and class. And there's profound uncertainty in the pandemic. It's placed us all in this perpetual limbo land where reports of or expectations around how long the pandemic will last seem to stretch out indefinitely, making it difficult to plan and make sense of this new reality we're enduring every day. It feels so unprecedented, and we're constantly grappling with this elusive sense of normality and a sense that things have been fundamentally changed forever. And I believe we're developing a new sense of kind of collective interdependence, and paradoxically, we also still feel very alone and isolated, as Laura kind of articulated so clearly. And so I'm also just aware that in this kind of space of limbo, politicians are kind of fomenting fear of the present, fear of the future, and how those can be used to kind of push forward more kind of regressive politics or clamp down on gains that we've made in the past. We see these tendencies play out as marginalized communities, migrant workers, sex workers, prisoners, Black communities, older and disabled people, tenants are scapegoated and pitted against each other, or when care institutions double down on security and safety measures to keep people alive, but with little regard to quality of care, work, or life and death in those places. And so, but there's also been, a lot of pushback, and there's actually been some really exciting gains that have been made during this time, pushing for more expansive political platforms and maybe even revolutionary visions of the future. And so I'm just wondering if maybe the speakers can speak to these kind of contradicting tendencies and how this kind of limbo space and period of upheaval has kind of set this new terrain for struggle in terms of how we are imagining the future and what's possible in this time, and how care and care work can really be mobilized in different ways. Yeah, and maybe I'll leave it at that for now, and just kind of thinking through what are the new possibilities of a more caring and careful future, as Drew called it. That's just to get the ball rolling.
So this is Drew speaking. If any of the panelists wants to respond to that, we can go forward, or we can move forward with some of the audience questions. We've got a number of great questions, so. So maybe I will just move forward with a question that is coming from someone who identified as an Ontario teacher who's unionized with the OSSTF, but currently transitioning into care work in LTC homes, long-term care. And they said, it's clear from the excellent presentations today that as a society, we don't value care workers for reasons of racism, xenophobia, and sexism, and how they play out through neoliberal capitalism. And we as a society do not value people who are deemed unproductive. So what are your thoughts on other reasons why there has been so little attention from the media and the public historically, but also currently, given the labor struggles of care workers like PSWs? What is happening in the labor movement and in healthcare unions that is the case? And that was sort of particularly directed towards Nicole, but also if anyone else wants to step in.
Nicole speaking. Sorry, the muting and unmuting is always a struggle. Yeah, I think actually I can respond a bit to both Mary Jean's issue that she posed, as well as the question that you just brought forward, Drew. One of the things that that I have been thinking about a lot lately is a certain strategy that at least I could see coming forward from healthcare unions that was a lot different from strategies that I saw being put forward by non-healthcare unions during the pandemic. One was very much for non-healthcare unions was the new needs that were arising from the pandemic. Like there's all these new things that are new to our members, that are new to people because of the pandemic that we have to address, which would kind of suck the air out of the room for larger strategic questions. I think for a lot of healthcare unions, this has been a win, or the idea of this being a window was very quickly realized. Those various communication strategies, various political strategies had been in place for years to varying degrees of success. And when the pandemic hit, along with devoting a lot of attention towards those kind of immediate new needs caused by the pandemic, there was a lot of time devoted to this strategic window of now is the time that people are walking. Now is the time people are watching. Let's make this count. But it's also for healthcare unions in Ontario in particular, because I was describing the issue of Hilda and the no right to strike within the healthcare setting. It's really hard to do anything that garners that political attention, which means that healthcare unions have, to a large degree, switched their strategic focus, for better or for worse, to lobbying efforts, to bureaucratic, legalistic efforts, because there is, with a lot of healthcare workers, there is not that moment of the struggle of the strike to garner public attention. It is the thing that kind of makes the public have to listen, makes media have to pay attention when you barricade a road off and don't let people pass. When you can't do that, the media gets to pick and choose whether or not they pick up your story, and which has meant the professionalization and bureaucratization of a lot of healthcare unions in Canada in particular, and a particular emphasis on legalistic and lobbyistic struggles. There's issues with that for sure. I just feel like that's the reality right now.
So if there's no one else burning to comment, we also had another question that was.
I believe Odelia wanted to talk.
Oh, pardon me, sorry.
I wanted to pick up a little bit on some of this and maybe make some links, but it may be drawn out in some of the other questions and answers. Mary Jean's, question about new possibilities and future. I mean, this window that Nicole is talking about, I think we're seeing in Ontario anyway, a huge push for access to paid leave in terms of paid sick days. And I mean, it's interesting to see how that's developed even in the last few days, but this idea that we all benefit from the opportunity that we give to individuals to be able to take that time away from work is something that we are, I think, starting to understand more clearly. So that's one of the areas that I see some hope. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about as well, and link to what Laura was talking about, and highlight for those folks who are south of us, was that during this entire during the pandemic, there was a news event that almost went uncovered by the media, but was very much discussed by the disability community, and that was the passage of Bill 7 in the federally that granted more access to medical assistance in dying in Canada. And when so we're talking about preservation of certain lives and simultaneously access to death instead of support in life for other lives, which during the course of the pandemic, and that's also something that we're going to have to contend with after we're through this. So I wanted to highlight that and also bring that forward for discussion, because I think it really speaks to how caregiving, depending on who the caregiving is for, is valued or devalued.
This is Laura talking, and I was following that the passage of that law, and very much struck by the enthusiasm for infrastructure to allow people to die, rather than enthusiasm for infrastructure to allow people to live well, particularly disabled people. And again, and this of course is that's like a whole nother, we could have a whole nother panel, right, on that particular issue. And I guess I just want to say that there's something going on in the States right now, which is a very different conversation about infrastructure, because our current President Biden has put forward a new American Jobs Plan. And in that plan, part of it is a redefinition or an expanding of what gets classified as infrastructure. And the plan is particularly expanding leave time to provide care, expanding, funding for healthcare, home care workers, and lots of other things. But the idea here is that the infrastructure, this notion of infrastructure, should include caregivers, including paid care workers, and that is an enormous shift. And I think it's so interesting that you're talking about what's happening in Canada with that kind of infrastructure, and then we're sort of talking about this other opportunity around infrastructure. And I don't know if other people, have more to say on the Biden plan, but I think it is really interesting that that's being put forward, and that much of the discussion or the pushback has centered on, well, what's infrastructure, and care isn't infrastructure. And then the whole pushback is rhetorically to be like, no, care is actually infrastructure. It allows people to live and work. And this is, this is part of our infrastructure. So.
So building on that, one of the questions that had come through was also asking about how people involved in your research are changing their relationships with institutions, or maybe their understanding of institutions that have sort of collectively been understood, at least, as supposed to protect or intervene or prevent these kinds of challenges. And hopefully I'm conveying the question accurately, but they were sort of asking about, are practitioners and users moving towards these structures or away from them, or maybe something else, demanding something different? So maybe that's a direction to build from a bit more.
I think I'll take a stab at that question, and I actually like the thoughts behind the question, and specifically for the groups that I study in African immigrants who clearly articulate, right, the kinds of exploitation that they face. Home care workers who clearly articulate a sense of not belonging to the United States, and through the lens of care, right? They felt that, well, we're in people's homes, but then all we get back is at the interpersonal level, shame, humiliation. They had these sort of interactions of racism, although they did have positive interactions as well. And then on the people who work at in institutional settings, for example, nurses also experience the kinds of structural racism, concentrations of Black and Brown nurses in the kinds of the specializations that people devalue, right? They experience being perceived as not skilled or knowing what they were doing. So I was always struck by the fact that even though they could articulate these at the various levels, these kinds of situations of injustice, there wasn't the sort of political will or the political actions to link up with unions or to sort of take part in mobilization in those ways. And I mean, people who study immigration and specific to these groups have sort of tried to theorize why, right? Sometimes people turn outwards. So immigrants may disengage, but sort of turn their efforts back to the home country, right? Put all their efforts into building a home or being active transnationally in their communities. So I have been very interested in seeing whether this moment, right, will sort of spark new forms of activism among this group and along the lines that the question indicated. So the jury is still out, but it's something that I will be personally interested in seeing how it moves in the future.
I could just add to that. This is Laura speaking, and it's so amazing to me. We are just in this, we're like in the moment, so it's hard to know what's going to play out or how it's all going to play out. But the more we understand all these different stakeholders, which is what's so great about having different people who have this expertise in different groups or different stakeholders, that we can talk about how people are responding, right, to what's going on. And I think it's really interesting and complicated in terms of disability communities in particular, because even pre-pandemic, the common knowledge was the systems are hostile. They don't want to help you. I think the majority of US disability cases are denied for Social Security disability. You have to have a lawyer in order to try to ask to get disability and get home care services. You have to, I mean, there's the system in so many ways is hostile, and many disabled people talk about it as violent. And what I saw in the pandemic was a magnifying of some of the particularly disability justice communities led by disabled people of color, who said, look, the systems will not save you. We need to engage in radical collective care for each other and figure it out on our own. Meanwhile, you have the American Jobs Plan and the infrastructure bill like being pushed for like expansion of infrastructure. And I think it's so interesting that there are just these different pieces and these different moving parts to what people are trying to do on a bigger level. And then, you know, like Dr. Showers and Fumi was expressing, then there's reactions within those groups and within those labor collectives as well that we're all just kind of figuring out what the response is and what it should be and what it will be moving forward. And I'm deeply curious to witness how this unfolds.
Yeah, Nicole speaking. I wanted to add on to the question a little bit, to also talk about healthcare workers in Ontario and their reaction or relation to the system. So we've seen hospital workers, nursing home workers, home care workers across the board leaving the industries. As much as this is both a window to push back, it's also what everyone knows to be true is also so laid bare and in such a visceral and raw way. And then on top of that, the added expectations and added labor needed and added emotional labor that goes into care work in these industries right now has led to massive burnout, to massive disenfranchisement across our care workers in the province. And we've been losing people en masse from these industries as well. Yeah, when we talk about the not being given access to PPE, it took almost a year before unions could lobby the Ontario government to make N95 masks mandatory upon a health and safety inspection team member in the facility saying it was a necessary protective measure. We had, during the first months, not weeks, not days, but months of the pandemic, nursing home administrators telling people that they didn't want them to be wearing masks because that would scare the residents and or family members, or home care workers throughout the pandemic being given one mask for an entire shift for 8 hours, and not being given access to more or being expected to provide their own. Massive double shift and overworking within hospitals that's leading to greater and greater numbers of PTSD and suicide contemplation amongst hospital workers. And this is, like, I'm not just speaking from my own position within my own union, but this is the research that's coming out across the industry within different news reports and different studies that are being done right now on the state of affairs of health workers. And the watching residents die throughout the first wave, 2 waves of the pandemic for nursing home and retirement home workers, and the PTSD levels that these workers are facing without any added supports. There's a huge turn away from the system in that sense amongst these workers.
Yeah, and I think we also had a last comment from Odelia, and then I think unfortunately we're going to try to wrap up. I feel like we could go on for a lot longer in terms of the discussion, but maybe not in terms of Zoom. So hopefully this is just a beginning for everyone, but maybe Odelia can have a last word.
Well, I mean, in terms of thinking about this as a moment where we're either going to make progress or lose ground, as we were talking, I mean, I think about also the pushback as being demonstrative of people's clout and power. So I just noticed that through social media, while we're talking, that in about 20 minutes from now, there's an event that made me think, wow, they're really, that these issues are being taken seriously in terms of, maybe we want more, but in terms of caregiving and our collective caregiving. And that is that, as we've seen, there's been a real social effort to try and think about who needs to be prioritized and protected with vaccines. And we talk about our frontline workers and our essential workers. I was unaware that there's a movement. Apparently there's a group here in Canada called We Are All Essential that is gathering this afternoon. So, there's that pushback about in terms of the importance of this work, but sometimes when people, mobilize, and that backlash is actually a sign that maybe there is some significant progress also being made. So I just put that out there. I'd love to see some writing and commentary about that, and we'll think about it too. But that idea, we are all essential, as opposed to actually looking at who's doing the work and who is vulnerable and marginalized and why, and what we all gain from protecting each other collectively.
Thank you so much, Adelia, and everyone. This has been above and beyond my hopes and dreams. So I'm just so glad that we've had such a great turnout. There's so many questions that we haven't even managed to get to. I hope we've at least touched on some of them. And I just want to thank everyone again for being here and for contributing to the discussion, particularly the presenters providing such wonderful ground to explore, and the audience whose questions have been so thoughtful and generative. So my background is not in labor studies, but I'm so grateful for the GLRC for providing this opportunity to bring together my own interests in labor rights, as well as disability studies and caregiving in this context. Particularly the director, Dr. Luan Good-Gingrich, the executive committee members, Dr. Ethel Tungoen and Dr. Leah Bosco, as well as the Center for Feminist Research, who provided us with some additional funding. They've all just been so generous and so supportive. I want to especially thank the GLRC's admin assistant, Hajar Mavali, who has been doing this often invisible administrative and logistical labor as the coordinator, and has just been absolutely vital to keeping all of this running and getting this off the ground. So thank you to everyone, and I look forward to seeing all of your faces in person or on video again very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.